On June 4th, 1945, a group of P-47D fighter bomber aircraft took off from the Clark Field complex of air bases on the island of Luzon in the Philippines and joined a fierce battle that was occurring at what was then called the Balete Pass. American aircraft were buzzing everywhere in the skies over the Philippines as the climactic battles between American and Japanese forces were going on at this time. But there was something unusual about this particular squadron, and it wasn't just the curious colors on the tails of the planes. This unit of aircraft, technically part of the 58th Fighter Group of the U.S. Army Air Corps' 5th Air Force, was not from the United States, but Mexico. This was the famous 201st Fighter Squadron, known as the Aztec Eagles, commanded by Colonel Antonio Cardenas Rodriguez and Captain First Class Radames Gaxiola Andrade. The Aztec Eagles, consisting of about 25 planes, attacked numerous Japanese ground targets during the battle. Balete Pass, now called Dalton Pass, was highly strategic. It was the only place Japanese ground forces could use to get between the central part of the island of Luzon and the Cagayan Valley. The broader campaign that was going on at that time involved American troops pushing Japanese out of the Philippines, which they'd taken in early 1942, during the same offensive across the Pacific and Southeast Asia that had begun with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. In addition to the combat operations in the Philippines, the 201st Mexican Fighter Squadron also took part in bombing operations on the island of Formosa, more usually called Taiwan, in the closing days of the war in early August 1945, between the detonations of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In these final months of World War II, the Aztec Eagles flew 96 combat missions and lost 7 men, not all in combat. When they returned to Mexico City in triumph in November 1945, after the war was over, the members of the squadron were honored with a parade, several in fact. President of Mexico, Manuel Avila Camacho, was there, and the event was highly publicized in the Mexican and world press. It was the most visible crowning achievement of Mexico's effort in the Second World War. To this day, the Aztec Eagle Squadron is the only unit of the Mexican military ever to participate in combat outside of Mexico. Another significant aspect of Mexico's participation in World War II was the Bratzel program. Pursuant to an agreement between Mexico and the United States, thousands of farm and railroad workers from Mexico were brought to the United States beginning in the summer of 1942 to fill the gap of labor shortages left by large numbers of Americans joining or getting drafted into the armed forces. This was the largest guest worker program in American history, and it continued on after the war, in fact until the 1960s. This was a major legacy of the war. So yes, obviously, Mexico took part in World War II on the Allied side, and as a member of the Allies, Mexico came out of the conflict with a pretty impressive record. Only 7 casualties, which isn't bad compared to the 418,000 American deaths during the war, or the staggering 20 to 27 million suffered by the Soviet Union. Purely in terms of results versus sacrifice, few countries that participated in World War II can be said to have won more decisively at less overall cost than Mexico did. So that's it. Heroic Aztec Eagle Squadron, a big victory parade, 7 honored dead, flowers and ticker tape on the streets of Mexico City, and the Bratzel program. We're done here, right? That's all there is to learn about Mexico in World War II. You can go watch cat videos now? Well, not exactly. As is true with most topics in history, there's a lot more to this one than meets the eye. Why did Mexico get involved? Yes, 2 Mexican ships were sunk by German U-boats, but was that really what the war was about? Who were Mexico's leaders at this time, and what were they trying to accomplish? Were they dreaming of planting the cactus and eagle flag on the top of the Reichstag in Berlin? Spoiler alert, no, they weren't. So there must have been some other reasons at play here, right? These are some of the questions we're going to be dealing with in this video. The subject of Mexico in World War II seems at first glance almost like the definition of a footnote to to history. Although the world was consumed by military and political conflict between 1931 and 1945, no battles took place on Mexican soil. Mexico was never attacked or invaded. Its technical period of participation between its declaration of war on the Axis powers in May 1942 to the Japanese surrender in August 1945 was a bit more than 3 years. It's possible that Adolf Hitler might have known the name of the president of Mexico, Manuel Ávila Camacho, without looking it up. He did have a good memory, but he clearly didn't spend much time thinking about him. Mexico has nothing close to a greatest generation in its past, which is defined by the World War II experience, in anything like the way other countries, like the US, Russia, or Britain do. In short, it seems like Mexico's experience in the Second World War simply isn't worth a lot of real estate in history books or runtime on YouTube videos. The reality is that the story of Mexico in the Second World War is highly complex and quite a unique little volume on the vast shelf of stories about humanity's most destructive war. No, in this story, you're not going to get epic tank battles or naval engagements. Mexico had no D-Day, no Stalingrad, no Midway, or Leyte Gulf. Instead, there's a fascinating political, economic, and social drama involving no less than the completion of the tumultuous Mexican Revolution, and in many important ways, the forging of a national identity in the 20th century. My name is Sean Munger. I have a PhD in history, and my niche here on YouTube is deep dive, context-heavy examination of historical subjects you may not have thought about before. This video is the story, not very often told even in history books, of Mexico in World War II. Let me lay my cards on the table on what this video is about and what I think the story of Mexico in World War II means. My working thesis is that between 1939 and 1945, Mexican political leaders, particularly Lázaro Cárdenas and Manuel Ávila Camacho, leveraged the crisis of the global war both to achieve their objectives within Mexico's domestic political arena and also to jumpstart the process of modernization and industrialization of the country. Mexico's participation in the war was a political move, made not for the express purpose of projecting Mexican power overseas, but to accomplish political and especially economic goals within Mexico, which represented to the political leaders nothing less than the successful completion of the Mexican Revolution. Now, if you don't know much about 20th century Mexican history, I realize that what I just said might not mean much to you. Well, don't worry. As we move through this subject, I think you'll come to understand what I'm talking about. But even now, without having heard any of the background and context, you've hopefully already caught on that the story of Mexico in World War II is not about Mexico trying to conquer anything, or even about a substantive beef that Mexico had with the Axis powers, though as we'll see, they did have plenty of compelling reasons to be mad at Germany and Japan. Different countries had very different reasons for participating in World War II. For some countries, like Poland, France, or the Soviet Union, the stakes were absolutely and immediately existential. They were fighting literally for their national survival. Others, like Great Britain and the United States, were protecting the colonies and resources they controlled that were under threat by the fascist powers that were trying to take over ownership of those resources. Mexico's reasons for joining the war were unique. They weren't shared by any other country. The circumstances that led Mexico to declare war in May 1942 may look similar to those of other nations, at least on the surface, but they really weren't. The circumstances were uniquely Mexican. Thus, if you're looking for a simple explanation as to why Mexico joined the war that's similar to the reasons why other countries did, even other Latin American countries, my advice to you is stop looking. You do really have to understand Mexico's particular circumstances. That's the first lesson here. It's also worth keeping in mind that World War II represented a complete breakdown of the more or less normal system of how nation-states got things done and related to one another. Goals that the Mexicans wanted to achieve, like industrialization or achieving security from their meddlesome northern neighbor, the United States, weren't able to be pursued in the early 1940s by normal processes. Indeed, the wartime situation offered opportunities to advance those goals that didn't exist in peacetime, or at least weren't as attractive. War was a means to an end, and the end wasn't, in Mexico's case, victory in the same way other countries like the United States might have defined it. We also have to avoid the impression that Mexico was a powerless and unimportant country that joined World War II because it had no choice to do what the United States was doing at the time. That is absolutely not the case. Mexico and the United States had an adversarial relationship, certainly throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th. Mexican leaders were constantly seeking to protect Mexico's sovereignty and self-determination against meddling and overreaching by Americans. In fact, Mexico's participation in World War II was intended in many ways to enhance its sovereignty. So, while the American, US-centric version of history from the Monroe Doctrine onwards often portrays Latin American nations as nothing more than the tail being wagged by the dog of the United States, that vision is incorrect as a matter of fact and problematic as an instrument of imperialism. Mexico did not dance to the tune called by the United States. That is not what this story is about. So why does this subject matter? Why should you spend over 2 hours of your life learning about it when there's so many cute cat videos out there that aren't going to watch themselves? This story is important precisely because it complicates and adds nuance to how we should think about World War II. If you're a history aficionado, and you wouldn't be watching my channel if you weren't, chances are pretty good that the Second World War and all of its fascinating stories and implications rank fairly high on the scale of interesting historical topics. I've done several videos about the World War II era, most recently my video about August 1939, the last month before the outbreak of the war in Europe. But there's more to the story of that era than the highlights we all know: Pearl Harbor, D-Day, Stalingrad, Hiroshima, the Holocaust. The true story of World War II is much broader than all of that. This is a story that demonstrates how the war affected and was affected by other societies around the world. Furthermore, this story simply isn't very well represented on YouTube or in history content generally. If you type Mexico and World War II into the YouTube search engine, you'll get a lot of stuff about the Aztec Eagles, some of them shorts, and not a whole lot else. I decided to start this video with the Aztec Eagles because if people know anything about Mexico in World War II, chances are about 90% that that's the one fact they know. And if I didn't put it at the top of the video, people would be asking, well, when is he going to mention the Aztec Eagles? This video is not principally about the Aztec Eagles. They come in at the beginning, what I already told you a few minutes ago, and I'll mention them again briefly toward the end. The rest of this video has very little to do with them. It's going to be about the much deeper and more complicated threads of Mexico's involvement in World War II. And those threads are, in my opinion, much more consequential and much more illuminating. A couple of housekeeping matters before we continue. As you may know, I have a members section on this channel where you can see an ad-free version of this video with a considerable amount of extra material that goes into greater detail on some topics. Most of the chapters in this video have additional detail and context in the extended member section version. Also in the member section version, you won't see redacted images like this one. YouTube's ad-friendly guidelines are pretty sensitive about certain images, including Adolf Hitler, so in order to be able to monetize this video, no, sorry to tell you, even lowly historians deserve to be paid a fair wage for their work, I have to redact some of those images. But those images are restored in the members section version. So consider becoming a member to see the full and expanded version of this video. Finally, I am not from Mexico, and I am not a native or fluent Spanish speaker. In a story full of Spanish and sometimes Nahuatl-derived words and names, I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce some. I'm going to do my best, but I guarantee you right now that I'll fall short probably often. On a similar issue, as an English-speaking American, my principal sources for this video were in English. There's a list of them in the description and in credits at the end. There has been some really good scholarship on this topic in English. While I am aware that most of the sources, and probably the best sources, on Mexico in World War II are in Spanish and published principally in Mexico, I made an executive decision that the benefits of doing this video outweighed the limitations of doing it from mostly an English language source base. If you disagree with that decision, well, my usual refrain in this kind of situation is a cliche by now, so I don't even need to say it. Farewell and enjoy. Now, with all that out of the way, let's delve into the context behind the story of Mexico in World War II. The major piece of that context involves the Mexican Revolution, a subject so vast that if somebody wanted to, they could do an entire channel worth of deep dive content on and probably never finish it. That person would not be me. I'm going to tell you the basics of what you need to know and some other interesting things about Mexico in the pre-war era. That's in the next chapter. At the beginning of the 20th century, Mexico was ruled by Porfirio Díaz, who had first taken power in Mexico in 1876, and with only a very brief interruption, remained in control until 1911. Mexican historians have termed this lengthy period the Porfiriato. It was the next major phase in Mexican history after coming out of the French intervention of the 1860s, which I might do a video on in the future, and the reassertion of Mexican sovereignty after that, principally under Benito Juárez, the Mexican national hero of the 19th century. Juárez died in 1872. Díaz took control a few years later. During the period of the Porfiriato, Díaz wanted to modernize and industrialize Mexico, which was overwhelmingly rural and agrarian at that time. He invited foreign investment into the country, but investors from abroad, including the United States, were a little spooked at times by what they perceived as economic instability, peasant rebellions, and labor agitation. Principally, Díaz tried to keep a tight lid on that kind of thing, often with military force. Because he wanted Mexico to export more, the agricultural sector turned increasingly toward cash crops like coffee, tobacco, and sugar, rather than staple goods like wheat or corn that ordinary Mexicans lived on. And the land situation was intolerable. Much of Mexico's best land was concentrated in the hands of wealthy landowners. Their estates, or haciendas, became visible symbols of income inequality and advancing oligarchy. This, combined with a spirit of nationalism and political instability late in Díaz's reign, created ideal conditions for a revolution. The Mexican Revolution began to explode in 1910, when Díaz decided at first not to run for another term as president, then reversed that decision and tried to remain in power. Political rebellions against Díaz quickly coalesced into various competing revolutionary movements, and violence erupted all over Mexico. The chief aim of the revolution was land reform, to break up the haciendas and redistribute land to the lower classes. Labor issues and the influence of the Catholic Church in Mexican politics and national life were other major factors that were in the mix. I'm not going to go through the dramatic twists and turns of the Mexican Revolution. Suffice it to say, the decades of the 19-teens and 20s were violent and tumultuous ones in Mexico. The turmoil occasionally spilled over Mexico's borders. The one thing that most Americans know about the Mexican Revolution, often the only thing, involves this guy, Pancho Villa, viewed as sort of a romanticized Western bandit who raided across the border into New Mexico in 1916, causing U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to send troops into Mexico to capture him. They failed, in part because the United States quickly became distracted by the war, World War I, which it joined in April 1917. Mexico's revolution was roaring to its climax about this time, and with all the dramatic stuff going on elsewhere in Europe, particularly the muddy fields of France, the mishegas going on in Mexico didn't exactly capture the headlines of the world at that time. Mexico's relationship with the United States was, as I mentioned in the last chapter, often acrimonious. Even after the United States tore vast pieces of territory off of Mexico in the 1840s, American leaders often intervened in Mexico, sometimes with military force, in order to protect investments or respond to some incident or prevent some other country from doing something there. U.S. troops, for example, invaded and occupied the port of Veracruz in 1914, just one of many interventions the U.S. conducted, not just in Mexico, but all over Latin America during the 19th and 20th centuries. In addition to Diaz and the Hacienda system, bullying by the United States was one of the things Mexicans were tired of, and this too fed into the Mexican Revolution. Part of the reason why Pancho Villa was a hero in Mexico was because he was perceived as standing up against the United States. One of the important things that emerged from the Mexican Revolution was a new sense of Mexican nationalism, and a major feature of it was to assert Mexico's self-determination, apart from the influence and interests of the United States. In 1917, the powers nominally in control of Mexico at that time, principally Venustiano Carranza, drafted a new constitution which gave the government sweeping powers to enforce economic and social justice within Mexico. It sought to limit the power of the church, empower the lower classes, and most importantly for our purposes, gave the government the power to nationalize certain key assets and industries. Remember that. It becomes important later. By this time, two sides of the political spectrum within Mexico, liberals and conservatives, had crystallized into implacable enemies. The 1917 Constitution was mostly a liberal document, though notably it denied suffrage to women, and Carranza himself was considerably less liberal in his policies than a strict reading of the Constitution might suggest. The 1920s saw the focus of the revolution shift largely to political battles between leftists and rightists. These battles left a trail of bodies in their wake. Emiliano Zapata, an important revolutionary and proponent of land reform, was assassinated in 1919. Carranza was blown away the following year, 1920. Villa got his ticket punched in 1923. His political enemies hosed down his car, this very one, in fact, with bullets. Just as it looked like things were calming down a bit, a rebellion called the Cristero War broke out in 1926, mainly over the government's attempts to rein in the Catholic Church. This resulted in another assassination, that of Álvaro Obregón, who had just been elected president of Mexico in 1928, but who bought the farm even before he could take office when a Catholic gunman walked into a cafe where Obregón was having lunch and pumped 6 slugs into him. By the 1930s, Mexico's political life was dominated by politicians who had extensive experience in the revolution, and politics was essentially an extension of the revolution itself. In 1934, a man called Lázaro Cárdenas was elected president of Mexico. Cárdenas had been a soldier during the revolution. Here he is in its early days, 1913, and he was eventually a general. He fought with the constitutionalist faction, which eventually more or less won the Civil War raging in Mexico in the 19-teens. A committed liberal, opposed to the influence of the church, Cárdenas used the constitutional power of expropriation in the service of what he and many in Mexico saw as essentially the completion and legal formalization of the goals of the revolution, particularly land reform and economic nationalism. Cárdenas advanced land reform farther in the 1930s than any revolutionary-era leader had done before. He broke up large estates and redistributed them as sort of collective farms called ejidos. Now, this was not really analogous to the violent and sometimes genocidal process of farm collectivization that went on in the Soviet Union and in China following their revolutions. The ejido system was milder than that, but it did represent a major step toward the embodiment and completion of the revolution. Cárdenas's party was called the Partido Nacional Revolucionario, or PNR, the National Revolutionary Party. Now, we have to be careful here. The name of this party changes no less than twice over the course of our story. Also, the ideological orientation of the party changed over time as well, but in the 1930s, Cárdenas's time, it was firmly on the left of the political spectrum, acting as sort of an umbrella over various left-leaning and even socialist-oriented parties in Mexico. It wanted strong labor unions and championed the rights of poor and indigenous Mexicans. A couple of other things worth mentioning about Mexican politics. The term of the president of Mexico was set at 6 years. First it was 4, but later amended, and a president could not run for re-election, again as a result of an amendment. Originally, the president could be re-elected, but not consecutively. Secondly, labor and labor unions were very important in this period. The largest federation of trade unions was the Confederation of Mexican Workers, or CTM, Confederación de Trabajadores de México, which still exists today. Under the Constitution, the Mexican government could arbitrate labor disputes, as workers were thought to be expressly represented in the government. This plays into the important story of oil nationalization in Chapter 3. Outside the realm of politics, Mexico in the 1930s and 40s was a culturally vibrant and lively place, as it's been through all of its history. This period was arguably a heyday of art, literature, and cultural expression. Painter Frida Kahlo, owner of one of the most famous unibrows in history, was at the height of her career at this time. She had her first exhibition outside of Mexico in 1931, but she made an even bigger splash when her work was shown in New York in 1938 and 39, just as the war was beginning in Europe. Her husband, Diego Rivera, was part of a movement of mural artists who depicted the struggles of the poor and indigenous people in Mexico in vivid terms, as well as political and social themes that came out of the revolution. José Clemente Orozco was another important muralist, painting all throughout the years of the revolution itself and long afterward. David Alfaro Siqueiros was the third member of Mexico's most famous muralist trio. The murals, which influenced what in the US in the 1930s would become the WPA style of art, emphasized great forces of history upon Mexico and its people, and were frequently dramatic and sometimes even apocalyptic in their moods. Though some commentators have characterized the 1930s and 40s as a period of a slump in literature, there was still plenty of activity. Mariano Azuela, considered by many to be the quintessential writer to emerge from the Mexican Revolution, had his greatest success in 1915, but he was still writing throughout the 1930s and the subsequent decade. The contemporary Mexican novel was born with Agustín Yáñez's Al filo de agua in 1947, but that was certainly gestating during the World War II period. Mexican cinema boomed during the World War II era. In fact, it's called the Golden Age of Mexican cinema, which began in this period and continued into the 1950s. There were less than 30 major films produced in Mexico in 1940, but over 80 by the end of the war in 1945. And in fact, Churubusco Studios, Mexico's most important film studio, was founded in that year. The film industry shows one of the examples of symbiosis between Mexico and the United States. Yes, there was cooperation as well as antagonism, as we'll see. María Candelaria, a 1944 film, was the first Mexican picture to be screened at the Cannes Film Festival in France. Ahí está el detalle, or You're Missing the Point, is regarded as one of the finest comedy films made in Mexico. It came out in 1940 and starred Cantinflas, Mexico's true breakout star of this period. At the beginning of the World War II era, Mexico was much smaller than it is now in terms of population. About 20 million people lived in Mexico in 1940. That's less than the population of the Mexico City metropolitan area today. The population of Mexico City in 1940 was 1.75 million. That shows you how staggering the population increase has been since World War II. Mexico in the early 40s was overwhelmingly rural. It's hard to estimate the percentage of the rural population from official figures, because at the time, they classified any town over 15,000 people as urban. There were some factories and industry, but the lion's share of Mexico's population worked as farmers, as they had for generations. Ordinary people's homes were often made of adobe with terracotta tiles on the roof, and most floors were hard-packed dirt. It's hard to get a sense of Mexico in 1940 from just statistics and measurements. Most of the measurements we use to define the economic and social condition of a country were invented in and by developed countries like the United States and countries of Western Europe. And as a result, they show us a distorted view of what societies like Mexico were really all about. I'll say more about that issue in Chapter 12. But to give you an example, the role of women in Mexico at this time, and particularly the labor they did, wasn't captured by those American-centric economic statistics. Women in Mexican towns and villages did the washing and the cooking, they ground the corn, hauled water from the well, and took care of the children. None of these activities, which consumed most women's entire daily lives, registered on any economic scale, because usually no money was changing hands. But this was a huge amount of the kind of labor that was being done in Mexico in 1940, and even down to today. Let's not forget that. The purpose of this chapter was to lay the context for the story of Mexico in World War II, and to give you a brief snapshot of what life was like in the country at that time. Now we're going to start moving into the World War II era. We have to start with the event which occurred in 1938 that colored a great deal of the political events that were to follow. That was the nationalization of Mexico's oil industry, and that's coming up in the next chapter. Mexico's oil industry began in 1901, when the first commercial oil well was drilled in the country at Tampico by an American. He was California tycoon Edward Doheny, a speculator who got very wealthy in the early oil business. The character Daniel Day-Lewis plays in the 2007 film There Will Be Blood is based partially on Doheny. During the Porfiriato, Diaz encouraged American and other foreign investment in Mexico, including and especially its oil industry. By the 1920s, Mexico's oil industry was largely controlled by two major companies, neither of them Mexican. In addition to Doheny's interests, a company called El Aguila was developed by British oil tycoon Wheatman Pearson. He later sold his interest in this company to Royal Dutch Shell. In addition to pumping oil for export, these companies owned a great deal of land in Mexico, over 3 million acres by 1922. Later, various other companies got into the act, including Standard Oil and Jersey Standard. The foreign oil companies behaved in Mexico exactly as oil companies always behave. They drilled intensively, grew out of what was essentially a labor dispute. Mexican oil workers repeatedly attempt to organize, but were often thwarted by actions of the foreign oil companies. Actions both legal and illegal. In fact, the labor union federation I mentioned in the last chapter, CTM, was formed in part to advocate for the interests of these workers and coordinate their ability to strike. The dispute went into the courts. In December 1937, an arbitration board ruled in favor of the workers and against the oil companies. The oil majors thumbed their nose at the ruling, refusing to abide by the board's decision, and they appealed to Mexico's Supreme Court. This was occurring against a backdrop of a severe fiscal crisis within the Mexican government. It's complicated, but simply put, the Cardenas administration was running out of money. In the first 3 months of 1938, Mexico's economy and society were in free fall. Strikes had broken out everywhere, not just in the oil industry. There was a run on Mexico's banks. Construction and public works projects halted. Even the telephone system in Mexico City didn't work. It was run by a Swedish company that was mad at the Cardenas administration for suggesting that they might nationalize the phone companies. So, remember that appeal by the oil majors to the Mexican Supreme Court? On March 7th, 1938, the court denied it and ordered the companies to comply with the various labor requirements of the arbitration board. including the payment of 26 million pesos in lost wages. Predictably, the oil majors refused. Cárdenas, facing a political crisis that he couldn't survive unless he made a bold move, invoked the clause of the Mexican Constitution that enabled him to nationalize key assets. On March 18, 1938, Cárdenas announced his decision by radio, even before he informed his own cabinet. A crowd of 200,000 people gathered in Mexico City's great public square, the Zócalo, to cheer him. The move was popular because it vindicated the basic aims of the revolution, and it was also a very public FU to the foreign oil companies, who many Mexicans blamed for the economic crisis. The nationalization was a turning point in modern Mexican history and secured Cárdenas's legacy as the executor of the revolution. As you might imagine, the oil majors were incredibly pissed. How dare Mexico stand up for itself and actually protect its own assets? I mean, the nerve! The oil companies responded by organizing what they hoped would be a total boycott of Mexican goods, but especially oil. Cárdenas had founded a new government-run oil company called Pemex, and the oil majors refused to do business with it, or to sell to Mexico any equipment that it could use in its oil industry. Some in the American oil industry urged the Roosevelt administration to declare war on Mexico. FDR, though, was in a bit of a bind. Not only had his administration instituted a new policy toward Latin America, the Good Neighbor policy, where the U.S. pledged to stop doing things like, invading Latin American countries with troops when it didn't like something that was going on, but international events were also taking an ominous course. The same week that Cárdenas nationalized Mexico's oil, Germany absorbed Austria in a coup called the Anschluss, which was engineered by Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler had basically threatened to invade Austria if the country didn't immediately agree to a union with Germany. The Japanese had already expanded their designs in China with a full-scale invasion of southern China a couple of months earlier, beginning in July 1937. The horrific massacre of Chinese civilians by the Japanese army at Nanjing was still in the world's newspaper headlines in March 1938. And of course, the Spanish Civil War was still going on. I'm going to talk about that specifically in the next chapter. In short, with the world sliding toward war, the last thing the U.S. needed was an intervention in Mexico, or a controversy that might tip Mexico toward the fascist powers. Roosevelt was right to fear this. Right after the expropriation, the head of Mexico's new Office of Oil Experts met with German and Japanese representatives, offering them Mexican oil at sweetheart prices if they paid in hard cash and some manufactured goods. Perhaps more importantly for Cárdenas, it would keep Mexican oil workers employed. Recall that his government was committed to act on behalf of CTM, the big labor union federation, and crossing them would have been politically problematic. So he needed the deal with the Nazis. A few months later, in early 1939, a deal was made with the Japanese to supply oil to them. They badly needed it to continue their war in China, as FDR was threatening to turn off the tap of American oil to them, which he later did. These deals badly undermined the oil majors' boycott of Mexico. Thanks to skillful diplomacy by Mexican officials, Cárdenas's nationalization of foreign oil assets, which after all were its own assets to begin with, was now an accomplished fact, and the British and American oil companies would just have to sit there and take it in the kisser. By the time World War II began in Europe in September 1939, the crisis triggered by Mexico's nationalization of the oil industry was pretty much over. Strategic and military considerations were now at the forefront. By that time, Hitler had been handed the Sudetenland on a silver platter by Chamberlain at Munich, and he had proceeded to gobble up the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Spanish Civil War was over, with a de facto victory by Franco's fascist regime. Japan still held large parts of China. Everyone needed oil, and Mexico was still a major producer of it. The oil nationalization was one of the major long-term achievements of the Mexican Revolution, and it's the #1 bullet point in the political legacy of Lázaro Cárdenas as Mexican president. But it wouldn't have gone the way it did if World War II wasn't threatening at the same time. The move showed that Mexico was not just a tool or a playground of the United States and other powers. This has to be kept in mind as we move deeper into the story of Mexico's involvement in the war. In addition to being a potential oil supplier, Mexico had a lot of other stuff that various countries could use. For example, Mexico was a huge source of non-ferrous metals, one of the biggest in the world. Copper, lead, zinc, cadmium, bismuth, antimony, all kinds of materials that were useful in military hardware or machinery. And of course, silver, which Mexico still had a lot of, even after centuries of exploitation of that resource by the Spanish. Mexico also had agricultural goods. Though attempts to turn a country with a lot of poor farmers into a breadbasket to feed other countries often didn't go so well, Mexico could still theoretically grow and export a lot of grain. As Napoleon said, an army fights on its stomach. Furthermore, Mexico was strategic because of its proximity to the Panama Canal, which by 1939 was one of the world's most vital waterways. For this reason, Mexico offered significant possibilities to the Axis powers, should they, as they eventually would, end up at war with the United States. Mexico was a military enemy of the United States going back a century to the 1830s, and Germany had previously tried to leverage Mexico's long-standing antipathy to the US with the infamous Zimmermann telegram of 1917. Though using Mexico as a base for military attacks on the Panama Canal was definitely a far-fetched scenario in 1939, it wasn't totally outside the realm of possibility. The point I'm making here is that there are a number of reasons why foreign countries, both in or likely to be in the Axis or Allied camps, were interested in Mexico and found it to their advantage to muck around down there. So it shouldn't surprise you that German and other foreign agents were active in Mexico in the period before the outbreak of World War II and the phase after its outbreak, but before the United States got involved. And of course, there were lots of foreign citizens in Mexico long before the World War II era. On the eve of World War II, there were about 6,500 Germans, 6,900 Italians, and 4,300 Japanese citizens living in Mexico. Nazi propaganda efforts ramped up in 1938 after the oil nationalization. After all, Mexican conservatives who thought Cárdenas had gone too far might be tempted by propaganda painting him as a tool of communists and liberals. There was a branch of the official Nazi party in Mexico, and the party sponsored lectures and showings of propaganda films at events designed particularly to attract students and urban professionals. The Nazis tried to get their hooks into impressionable college students by offering scholarships to study in Germany. There were also anti-fascist organizations in Mexico trying to counter Nazi propaganda, and on one memorable occasion, they used the Nazis' racism against them. A group called the Liga pro Cultura Alemana was made up of anti-Nazi Germans and Austrians who lived in Mexico. They also organized a lecture tour, but unlike the Nazis, they managed to score this magnificent venue, the Palace of Bellas Artes in Mexico City. In October 1938, a German-born resident of Mexico wrote to the Nazi Party headquarters in Berlin, asking if his wife could officially be declared an Aryan under the Nazis' ludicrous Nuremberg laws. The party sent him back a questionnaire asking him to detail his wife's ethnicity back to 1800 to prove she had no indigenous heritage. The whole culture of Mexico is based on the mestizo, people of mixed European and indigenous heritage. The man, offended by the exchange with the Nazi Party, gave a copy of the correspondence to the Liga Society, who widely publicized it. Their leaflets pointed out in a large type headline that the Nazis considered most Mexicans to be a second-class race. German diplomats tried desperately to backpedal by publishing editorials in prominent newspapers defending the party, but the damage was done. Nazi ideology never caught on in Mexico among more than a lunatic fringe of hard-right fascist sympathizers. The Nazis' toxic racial ideology did, in fact, require them to hate Mexicans as much as they hated everyone else. In 1939, the Abwehr, one of Nazi Germany's intelligence agencies, began sending agents to Mexico. It was more than just the pipe dream of swaying Mexico toward the Axis side, which was never that realistic. But the Nazis realized that Mexico might be a good base from which to launch sabotage attacks against the United States and to base agents to spy on American interests. The two most important agents who operated in Mexico during the World War II era were Karl von Schliebrugge, codenamed Morris, and Georg Nikolaus, codenamed Max. Von Schliebrugge's main operation was to survey and map the whole coast of Mexico. Nikolaus was much more important, running field agents in Mexico to try to sniff out American defense capabilities and operations. Mexican authorities as well as Americans knew about these guys. Nikolaus was eventually arrested in 1942 before Mexico declared war. Von Schliebrugge had fled the country the previous year to avoid arrest. In contrast to the Germans, the Japanese never really developed a robust intelligence capability in Mexico. They were interested in it particularly as a place to gather reports on Allied shipping through the Panama Canal, and they did pass some of this kind of information on to Tokyo, some with the help of German agents. But most of the Japanese intelligence gathered in Mexico was of pretty low value, or was already known about. For example, Japanese agents passed on items they read in Time magazine. In any event, Japanese intelligence operations in Mexico ramped down after Mexico expelled the Japanese naval attaché in March 1942. Much of Japan's intelligence had routed through him. Though spies and spycraft are attractive subjects to look at in history, in the case of Mexico, there's really not much there. There is simply no evidence that any Axis spies got any useful intelligence out of Mexico that had any significant effect on the war. A development that was far more influential in Mexico than Axis propaganda in this period was the Spanish Civil War, which was roaring to its climax at about the time Cárdenas was nationalizing the oil and putting the finishing touches on the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. The Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936 between the left-leaning Republicans or Loyalists and the fascist forces of General Francisco Franco, usually known as the Phalangists. Yes, Franco absolutely was a fascist. I had a comment on one of my previous videos disputing that, and he was heavily supported, economically and militarily, by his fascist buddies in Europe, Mussolini and Hitler. Indeed, the Spanish Civil War was in many ways a dress rehearsal for the European phase of World War II, and its outcome, the fascists won in Spain, was quite depressing to anti-fascists around the world. Because of its historical, linguistic, and cultural kinship to Spain, the Spanish Civil War was a matter of special interest in Mexico. Cárdenas supported the Republicans against the fascists, and Mexico even sold some weapons to the Republican side. Both sides of the war carried on a battle of propaganda within Mexico to support their respective sides. But many refugees from the war in Spain sought asylum in Mexico, particularly those from the anti-fascist side. In 1938, Cárdenas said he'd be willing to take up to 50,000 Spanish refugees in Mexico, but objections by pro-Franco elements in Mexico caused him to delay actually admitting them. When Franco and his fascist forces emerged victorious in Spain in April 1939, however, there was no more delaying it, and many Spanish leftists began streaming into Mexico. Mexican conservatives were aghast, claiming that Cárdenas was opening the borders to communist infiltrators. Even members of the lower classes of Mexican agricultural and factory workers feared that they would end up competing for jobs with Spanish refugees. The far right within Mexico was also deeply affected by events in Spain. In 1938, a man called Saturnino Cedillo, a former warlord in the revolution, raised a private army in revolt against President Cárdenas, whom he'd formerly been allied with. Cedillo was championed by various conservative groups within Mexico who were opposed to the nationalization of oil and the ejido system of collective land that Cárdenas was advancing. Cedillo's rebellion never really had much of a chance, and in January 1939, Cedillo was shot. The failure of the Cedillo rebellion forced Mexicans on the far right to essentially look to Franco's fascist regime in Spain as their guiding light. They wanted to duplicate the example of Franco's victory in Spain over the leftists. This was part of the reason why the Nazis thought that papering Mexico with pro-fascist propaganda was a worthwhile use of their time and money. In short, had the Spanish Civil War not come first, Mexico's experience in World War II would probably have been significantly different. On the eve of World War II, President Cárdenas was hoping to update and modernize Mexico's armed forces. The fascist victory in Spain and the obvious war clouds gathering over Europe shot this one to the top of the priority list. On August 10, 1939, several Mexican military and civilian officials went to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City and asked to buy fighter planes from the United States as quickly as possible. This request was under advisement in Washington when the Mustache launched his invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. Now, suddenly, with the war having broken out in Europe, Mexico's military requests were seen in a different light. In October 1939, Sumner Welles, U.S. Undersecretary of State, told the Mexican ambassador that the U.S. would begin selling surplus arms to Mexico. They even arranged credit for the purchases. The quid pro quo, however, was that the U.S. asked Mexico for permission to fly reconnaissance missions over Mexico without prior approval. Cárdenas simply couldn't agree to this. If this request was granted, and others like it that would invariably follow, it would mean that Mexico would essentially outsource the responsibility for its defense to the United States. Yet another violation of Mexico's sovereignty by its northern neighbor, which, as you recall, had promised to stop meddling. Ultimately, the idea of the U.S. selling military hardware to Mexico was withdrawn. The FDR administration decided that any surplus stuff it had should go to democratic countries in Europe, notwithstanding the Neutrality Act. Cárdenas declared that Mexico would remain neutral in the European war. He thought the rightness of his actions was vindicated a few months later. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded its small neighbor, Finland. This was the start of the famous Winter War. Cárdenas interpreted this event as a demonstration that countries that shared borders with the major military powers were at considerable risk if those powers felt it was in any way advantageous to violate them. Since the United States had repeatedly violated Mexico's borders in the past 100 years, Cárdenas thought the threat of the U.S. was, for now, in late 1939, more dire than the threat of Germany or Japan, who were considerably farther away. Cárdenas had a bigger problem much closer to home. He couldn't be re-elected as Mexico's president in 1940, but he had to ensure that a member of his party and someone who would carry on the spirit of the Mexican Revolution as he saw it took over for him. If a right-wing candidate won, that would not only undo the most important legacies of the revolution, but a right-wing president might well throw Mexico's lot in with the fascists. In the light of Franco's victory in Spain and Hitler's armies on the march in Europe, this was an alarming prospect. How Cárdenas dealt with this problem is the subject of the next chapter. Party politics in Mexico in 1940 was not an open democratic process, as many successful politicians are. Lázaro Cárdenas was a party boss as well as a national leader. He chose as his handpicked successor Manuel Avila Camacho. I'll discuss him in a moment. Cárdenas's party, formerly called the PNR, had changed its name to the Partido de la Revolución Mexicana, or PRM, in 1938. In choosing Avila Camacho as his successor, Cardenas passed over his protege, Francisco José Mujica, who had been at Cardenas's side since the beginning of his administration, and even before. Mujica was a strong leftist, though, even farther to the left than Cardenas, and many people feared that if he was president, he would pull Mexico closer to the orbit of Stalin's USSR. Avila Camacho was a safer choice because he was more moderate, and the conservatives might, if you reached out to them, might not revolt en masse against him. Avila Camacho could be counted upon, Cardenas thought, to preserve and carry on the main legacies of the revolution. But he could also hold the country together in the crisis of the war, which in 1940 was greatly ramping up in Europe and Asia. Manuel Avila Camacho, age 43 in 1940, was from the Mexican state of Puebla. He took part in the revolution beginning in 1914, rose to the rank of brigadier general, and by 1920 was firmly in the orbit of Cardenas, who was rising in power in the state of Michoacán. In 1937, Cardenas made him Secretary of National Defense. He also had an older brother, Maximino Avila Camacho, who pops up again later in our story. Maximino was arrogant and flamboyant. Manuel was generally quiet and retiring. The right wing in Mexico was, though significant and powerful, not too well organized in 1940. It wasn't clear until late 1939 who would be the standard bearer against Cardenas's regime. Eventually, the man who the conservatives coalesced around came forward, Juan Andreu Almazan. Like almost all Mexican politicians in this period, Almazan had fought in the revolution. He was a Zapatista, supporting the faction of Emiliano Zapata against Pancho Villa. He served in government, serving Plutarco Calles, president of Mexico from 1924 to 1928. In the 1930s, Almazan got rich on silver mining concessions, and by 1940 was one of the richest men in Mexico. As a conservative, he was naturally aghast at Cardenas's oil nationalization and many of his other policies. During the 1940 campaign, Almazan promised to reverse the nationalization decision. He was not openly pro-fascist, but the far right vastly preferred him to Avila Camacho. In May 1940, the mustache struck at the Low Countries and France. Mussolini's Italy declared war on France on June 10, 1940, after Germany had mostly defeated France. But this move had the effect of closing the Atlantic to any trade by Mexico with the European Axis countries. Military preparedness was ramping up in the United States, and Roosevelt was in the middle of the political drama about whether or not he'd seek a third term. Spoiler, he did. The 1940 election in Mexico was extremely controversial, and there's some evidence that it was rigged. Avila Camacho, Cardenas, and leaders of his party, the PRM, apparently made a deal with the U.S. State Department. The FDR administration would not make moves to undermine Avila Camacho's assumption of the Mexican presidency, on the understanding that Avila Camacho wouldn't oppose the granting of bases in Mexico to the U.S., or some kind of military agreement. In order to get the support of the PRM as the candidate, Avila Camacho apparently had to agree not to criticize Cardenas, and most importantly, leave his reforms on the books. The presidential election occurred on July 7, 1940. Violence broke out at polling places throughout Mexico. Supporters of Almazan tried to take over voting booths, supposedly to prevent meddling by the PRM. Almazan's supporters wore green ribbons, and anecdotally many people, at least in the cities, saw green ribbons all over the place, indicating that support for Almazan was strong. But as we know here in the US, this isn't a very good predictor of electoral support, like trying to call an election based on how many lawn signs you see around. The FBI, which was monitoring the election, believed that Mexico's Electoral Commission, which would certify the winner, was controlled by Cardenas and the PRM and would declare Avila Camacho the winner no matter what happened. Street violence surrounding the vote left 30 dead and 150 wounded throughout Mexico. Even the sitting president, Cardenas, couldn't vote at his polling place because the doors were locked as a result of violent threats. On July 8th, the major Mexico City newspapers declared that Almazan had won. Avila Camacho had already declared victory the night before, in a proclamation whose text leaked to the press before the polls were closed. However, it was obvious that despite all the green ribbons in the cities, the PRM had very strong support in rural areas. It just wasn't clear who actually won. On July 17th, 1940, Almazan fled to Cuba, where a meeting of the Pan-American Conference was going on. However, U.S. officials, including Cordell Hull, refused to meet him. Turns out that palling around with fascist sympathizers wasn't a good look. Almazan remained out of the country, and throughout August and September, the question was where would he go to build support for a movement to seize the presidency. Almazan briefly wound up in Mobile, Alabama, but widespread support for him, especially in the U.S. government, was lacking. While this was going on, a curious foreign drama was playing out in Mexico. This nice little place in Mexico City, now a museum, is where Soviet emigre Leon Trotsky lived from April 1939 to August 1940. Trotsky was instrumental in building the Soviet Red Army and was a major figure in the early foundation of the Bolshevik regime after the Russian Revolution of 1917. In the 1920s, his well-known political and ideological fight with Stalin determined the future of the USSR, which turned out to be a grim one. Trotsky lost that fight and went into exile in Turkey, in France, Norway, and eventually Mexico City. Cárdenas let him into the country in part for political reasons, to deflect accusations that he, Cárdenas, was too friendly to communists and the Soviet regime. He'd show everybody by hosting Stalin's worst enemy. When he arrived in Mexico in 1937, Trotsky began an affair with Frida Kahlo, the famous painter who popped up in Chapter 2. Trotsky was still a major figure in the ideological struggles of communism, and Stalin, who never forgave a slight, was still out to get him. In this room, on August 20th, 1940, a man called Ramon Mercader, a Mexican communist and secretly a member of the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, buried an ice axe in Trotsky's head. He chose that weapon, this is the very one in this picture, because he was adept at mountaineering. My 8th grade students always wince when I tell this story. I mean an ice axe, that's pretty hardcore. Trotsky did not die right away, but died in a hospital the next day. Mercader was convicted in a Mexican court and spent 19 years in prison. On September 15, 1940, the Mexican Congress officially declared Manuel Avila Camacho the winner of the presidential election. Almazan was basically finished by this point. His support was weak, and the United States wouldn't back him, for fear that his rebellion would throw Mexico into chaos just when the war crisis was getting worse. In September 1940, FDR and others feared Hitler was about to attack Great Britain. He didn't, but the fear was real at that time. Did Avila Camacho, Cárdenas, and the PRM steal the 1940 election? It was definitely a corrupt election, but I don't think so. Almazan's support around the country was in the cities, but the majority of the countryside seems to have been solidly for Avila Camacho. Given the popularity of the oil nationalization and the fact that public opinion seems to have turned against conservatives and supporters of the European fascist regimes, I think it's a fair bet that Avila Camacho could have won fairly. The leadership of Mexico in the war period was significantly linked to that of the United States. Avila Camacho had won, and he would take over as Mexican president on December 1st, 1940. But Franklin Roosevelt had yet to win his own election. I won't get into many of the details of the 1940 U.S. presidential election. FDR essentially campaigned on military readiness and the need for adequate preparation for the growing fascist threat abroad. His opponent, businessman Wendell Willkie, essentially campaigned on no third term. In peacetime, that might have been a compelling argument, but not when Hitler was sitting on most of Western Europe and Japan was on the move in Asia. In the election, on November 5th, 1940, Roosevelt ground Willkie into sausage, at least in the Electoral College, winning 449 votes to the Republicans' 82. With Avila Camacho now in the presidential palace, though, both Mexico and the US had to clear the decks of pesky baggage and divisive issues in order to prepare for the conflict that both countries seemed to have believed by the end of 1940 was inevitable, or at least extremely likely. For example, there was some crucial business left over in the wake of the oil nationalization that still had to be settled, and the very large question of Mexico's role, if any, in the US's war preparations. That story plays out during the critical year of 1941, which is the subject of the next chapter. Let's take a very brief break. Many of you have asked how you can support my work. There are a couple of different ways. I have a Ko-Fi link, which is in the description. You can make a one-time donation, any amount you like, and everything, even a very small amount, is greatly appreciated. One thing you could do to support me is to buy one of my books. I've written several books available on Amazon, usually Kindle and paperback versions. Many are fiction. Yeah, I know, I'm kind of weird that way. My latest book is called The Gangster Crown, and it's a story about urban gangsters in the 1990s and 2000s, kind of a modern-day Scarface, but a little more like the classic 1930s Scarface than the Al Pacino version. Also in 2024, I had a mystery come out called Daniel Vanished, about a man who teams up with a podcaster to solve the long-ago unsolved disappearance of his childhood best friend. Probably my best book, although easily the weirdest, is The Valley of Forever, which is about several characters trapped in various loops of time, including a man who goes back in time to kill himself, an ocean liner that catches on fire over and over again, and a valley in the Himalayas where the 18th century never ended. I told you it's weird. Links to those books are also in the description. You could also support me by taking one of my online courses on my website, seanmunger.com. I have classes on Vladimir Putin, the history of conspiracy theories in America, and the big one, the origins of a particular catastrophic event in recent American history, which is tricky to mention by name without getting demonetized. Anyway, check it out. That course in particular is extremely in-depth and very much worth the price of admission. If you can't do anything financially, which is fine, there are some free courses on my site as well. My Pearl Harbor course has been going for 5 years now and is still my highest enrolled course. It's absolutely free. I also have one on the history and legend of the Holy Grail. There's also a members section on this channel where you can see ad-free and expanded versions of my recent videos, including this one. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Now, let's get back to Mexico in the World War II era. Shortly after becoming President of Mexico, Manuel Avila Camacho made a public statement that was extremely consequential and became a key part of his political legacy. The heart of it was just 2 words, soy creyente, which means I'm a believer. He meant in Christianity and the Catholic Church. The importance of these 2 words can't be overestimated. It's one of the few major ways in which Avila Camacho himself altered the course of the legacy of the Mexican Revolution, as opposed to simply rubber stamping or crystallizing the legacies already set up by Cárdenas. A major factor in the revolution, and one of its underlying causes, was the role of the Catholic Church in Mexico's political and social life. The revolution played out in part as an anti-clerical movement, which is how we got the Cristero Rebellion of 1926-29, a major reaction to the forces of the revolution. Mexico is a fiercely and passionately Catholic country. Land reform and breaking up the haciendas and such was one thing, but curbing the church made many Mexicans uneasy, and it was a continuing source of conflict in the subsequent years. Avila Camacho's declaration of soy creyente signaled that he would not be ideologically anti-clerical. The Mexican Constitution of 1917 contained several provisions that the state could use to counter the influence of the church. Cárdenas used some of them and left others alone to avoid generating too much conflict. Avila Camacho openly supported some Catholic initiatives, and during his term, the provision of the Constitution that mandated socialist education in Mexican schools, a major irritant to the church, was repealed. Avila Camacho's attitude toward the United States was symbolized by the red carpet that was rolled out for the new vice president-elect, Henry Wallace, who visited Mexico to attend Avila Camacho's inauguration. Wallace was FDR's second vice president, replacing John Nance Garner, and he hadn't even been sworn in yet, but his presence in Mexico, together with Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, was a signal to the world that U.S.-Mexican cooperation was strong. It wasn't really, but both sides wanted it to be, mainly for economic reasons for Avila Camacho and military ones for Wallace and FDR. At the very end of March 1941, Mexico allowed 12 ships from Axis powers, 10 from Italy and 2 from Germany, to anchor at the ports of Tampico and Veracruz. The crew of one of the Italian ships, the Atlas, tried to sink her in Tampico harbor by opening the seacocks and smashing the engine cylinder heads with sledgehammers, apparently trying to destroy the ship to prevent it from eventually falling into American hands. Mexican officials suspected the Axis crews of being up to no good, and they arrested them and seized the 12 ships. Similar seizures happened at the same time in several other Latin American countries, including Venezuela. Mexican newspapers accused Germany and Italy of planning subversive activities inside Mexico. The Atlas incident further soured Mexico's relationship with Germany and Italy, and was a significant step toward war. Negotiations and cooperation continued between Mexico and the U.S., sometimes acrimonious, but gradually finding a way forward. On July 10, 1941, Mexico announced, after a breakthrough in negotiations, that it would prohibit the export of all, quote, basic and strategic materials to all non-American countries. In other words, it would sell all its key stuff only to the United States or other Latin American countries who weren't doing business with the Axis powers. Furthermore, on July 15, 1941, Mexico concluded a deal with the U.S. Federal Loan Agency that facilitated the purchase by American federal agencies dedicated to stockpiling materials for a potential war of greatly increased quantities of Mexican-produced commodities. What this means is that Mexico was making sweetheart deals to supply strategic war materials to the United States on especially favorable terms, and on a more or less exclusive basis. Even before Pearl Harbor, Mexico was already set up as a major supplier of stuff the U.S. war effort would eventually need. Avila Camacho and the Mexican government were fully preparing for war. They had tightened control over munitions production in the country, which sparked a negative reaction among workers in that industry. On September 23, 1941, a crowd of about 2,000 people, including many members of the Union of Workers of War Materials, marched on the National Palace in Mexico City. Their purpose was to deliver a petition to President Avila Camacho, protesting that the general in charge of the government's principal munitions factory was ignoring the terms of their labor contract. The confrontation became violent, and members of the army guarding the National Palace fired on the crowd. At least 7 people were killed, probably more. This kind of incident, if it had happened a few years earlier, would have flared into a huge political problem in Mexico, killing striking workers right in front of the president's residence. But in September 1941, it didn't. It sort of died down. Some of the newspapers blamed the incident on agitation by Nazi agents, a convenient excuse and almost certainly untrue. What the massacre meant was that even the labor union sector in Mexico was willing to go along with the government in time of impending war. The U.S. and Mexico were clearly making progress in establishing a relationship that would strengthen what both countries called hemispheric defense. And as I mentioned a minute ago, the relationship regarding defense materials was taking shape. But the biggest problem that had to be solved involved the hangover from the oil expropriation of 1938, still the most divisive issue between the U.S. and Mexico. Solving this issue became of paramount importance after the U.S. cut off oil shipments to Japan in the summer of 1941, an economic move that would eventually lead to Pearl Harbor. Whatever had been said about boycotts back in 1938, by 1941, with most of the world at war, the U.S. was importing 13 million barrels of petroleum from Mexico. 92% of Mexico's oil products were being bought by the United States. It behooved both countries to solve the outstanding issues left over from the expropriation. They finally did, an agreement whereby Mexico would reimburse American oil companies approximately $23 million for assets seized in 1938 was negotiated. Interestingly, this key agreement was signed on November 19, 1941, just in the nick of time. The oil issue probably would have been solved quickly even if it had still been hanging out there at the time of Pearl Harbor, but it was fortuitous that the biggest issue between the US and Mexico was taken off the table just a week or so before Japanese carriers began crossing the Pacific toward Hawaii. The story of the Pearl Harbor attack is well known. I'm not going to go into the details here. Suffice it to say, securing oil reserves, particularly from Southeast Asia, was a significant motivation of the Japanese. Because Mexico was a major oil producer, and by late 1941 was no longer supplying the Japanese oil, Mexico was indirectly part of the Pearl Harbor story. What was early morning in Hawaii on December 7, 1941, was afternoon in Mexico in the east coast of the United States. Most of the major members of President Avila Camacho's cabinet were enjoying the weekend at their country retreats. After the Japanese bombs fell at Pearl Harbor, Mexican officials' phones began ringing. The Avila Camacho administration reached out to the American embassy in Mexico City. Josephus Daniels, former Secretary of the Navy during World War I, and incidentally a pretty grotesque white supremacist, was ambassador to Mexico at this time. I should mention that at the Havana Conference of 1940, the same one that Juan Almazan had tried to gatecrash to drum up support for his unsuccessful challenge against Avila Camacho's victory in the election, the Latin American countries, plus the United States, agreed that any attack on any country in the Americas would be tantamount to an attack on all of them. Well, the Japanese had definitely attacked the United States. On the evening of December 7th, while battleships burned at Pearl Harbor, the Mexican Foreign Office delivered an official note to Ambassador Daniels. It read, quote, "Mexico declares that its conduct will inflexibly follow the postulates of justice and of honor, which it has until today maintained without hesitation. In the premises, it believes it appropriate to recall that, in accordance with the resolution adopted in the meeting of the foreign ministers at Havana in 1940, one of these postulates is the fact that any aggression against any nation of this hemisphere will be considered by our country as an aggression against our own sovereignty." End quote. Now, this sounds conclusive, but it's not. President Avila Camacho, meeting with his cabinet on December 7th, decided that in order to honor the Havana Declaration and support the United States, they had to sever all relations with the Axis countries. But they also decided to stay out of the war itself and fell short of an actual declaration of war until and unless Mexico itself fell under attack. That's a pretty significant difference. So what did Mexico do in the 6 months between Pearl Harbor and its own official declaration of war? That's the subject of the next chapter. In general, the reaction of Latin America to Pearl Harbor was swift and overwhelmingly supportive. The U.S. Congress declared war on Japan on December 8, 1941, following FDR's famous Day of Infamy speech. Hitler declared war on the U.S. on December 11th, and Mussolini, by now reduced to a relatively powerless bootlicker in the Axis alliance, followed suit. 9 countries in Latin America, Costa Rica, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama, declared war on the Axis powers shortly following Pearl Harbor. Almost all the others at least severed diplomatic and commercial relations with Germany, Italy, and Japan. Mexico cut off relations and strongly condemned the attack, but did not declare war. Avila Camacho was moving cautiously. He definitely wanted to support the U.S., but he also recognized that the idea of getting into the war wasn't universally popular among the Mexican public. In fact, a solid majority of them opposed it. He had most of the left-leaning political organizations on his side, including trade unions. There was, for example, a lavish parade in Mexico City organized by union leaders in support of President Avila Camacho on December 9, 1941. But another organization, called the Union Nacional Sinarquista, a conservative, pro-Catholic, foaming-at-the-mouth anti-communist front, spread editorials typically blaming communist agitators for trying to recruit Mexicans to go fight the Japanese, and pledged to try to keep Mexico out of the war. The Sinarquista, which was kind of like Mexico's equivalent to the America First Committee in the United States, had significant support among the rural peasantry, in large part because of their sympathy toward the Catholic Church. Mexico was in a unique position among Latin American countries. It alone had once been officially at war with the United States and had suffered the loss of huge amounts of its territory. So naturally, antipathy toward Mexico's northern neighbor lingered a long time in the memories of ordinary Mexicans. This was a factor not present in other Latin American countries who had much less to lose politically by siding reflexively and prominently with the U.S. So it makes sense that in the first few months, Avila Camacho tried to steer a more moderate course. That's not to say that Mexico was anywhere close to supporting the Axis powers. Far from it. In his first major speech after Pearl Harbor, on December 9, 1941, President Avila Camacho made clear that Mexico would aid the U.S. war effort. He said, quote, "Our fight will not take place in the trenches, but rather in the factories and in the fields, in order to increase the capacity of our economy, to strengthen the productivity of our commerce, and in order that all efforts might be directed to the same end, to contribute to the security of America." End quote. By the way, his use of that word America did not mean the United States, but the whole Western Hemisphere, including Mexico. It's important to remember that in the days and months immediately following Pearl Harbor, no one was sure how far the Japanese were going to continue their cross-Pacific offensive. They'd hit Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and in late 1941 and early 1942, they were pressing their attacks forward in the East Indies and Southeast Asia. Would they attack the west coast of the U.S. or Mexico? Nobody could rule that out. On December 10, 1941, Avila Camacho put Mexico's west coast under a new military jurisdiction called the Región Militar del Pacífico. In a political masterstroke, he also appointed Lázaro Cárdenas, former president, as the commander of this bureau. Because Cárdenas was still revered by elements of the government to Avila Camacho's left, the move significantly increased political unity behind the war effort and the administration, which, as you recall, had been only on the job a year by this point. Cárdenas's appointment also signaled that the U.S. wasn't likely to be allowed carte blanche to operate its military inside Mexico, which many Mexicans feared would be the case. Cárdenas had been a fierce defender of Mexican sovereignty, and people knew that he could and would stand up to the United States if it tried to overreach. Indeed, U.S. officials sometimes found Cárdenas frustrating, but that was the point. Avila Camacho was determined to conduct Mexico through the war without becoming a puppet of the U.S. Mexico did grant some American military requests to conduct military operations in Mexican territory. For example, overflights of planes in border areas and the setting up of radio transmitters and detection stations in various places. However, Mexico put significant restrictions on U.S. forces. When operating in Mexico, they could not be armed and they could not be in uniform. Avila Camacho wanted to avoid the spectacle of uniformed American troops patrolling Mexican soil. Invasions of U.S. or Mexican territory were pretty much beyond the capability of the Japanese at the beginning of 1942. That doesn't mean that they weren't thinking of it, though. There is some limited evidence that the Japanese embassy in Mexico was at one time cooking up a plan to send a fleet to Acapulco, take it over, and establish a Japanese base there. Serious? Well, probably not, but at least somebody was thinking of it. But interestingly, Mexico also moved against Japanese citizens inside its borders, even before Mexico officially declared war. There weren't a lot of Japanese in Mexico, as I said earlier, but the largest single community, about 3,600 Japanese in Baja California, many of whom worked in the cotton industry. Fearing that Baja California might become a platform for a Japanese attack on U.S. Navy assets at San Diego, Mexican authorities rounded up Japanese in Baja California in January 1942 and sent them to Mexico City or Guadalajara. Now, I have to be careful with this. Although this was going on at the same time as people of Japanese descent, including U.S. citizens, were being interned in camps in the United States, the infamous Japanese-American internment, probably the worst civil rights violation of World War II by the Roosevelt administration. This was not done in Mexico. First, Japanese were ordered to go to Mexico City or Guadalajara, but they weren't put in camps. Once in those cities, they were free to come and go as they pleased, work in businesses, whatever. Secondly, this was done to Japanese citizens, not Mexican citizens of Japanese descent. The U.S. program of Japanese-American internment was done on the basis of racial profiling, and most of the people interned in the U.S. camps, like Manzanar in California, were U.S. citizens. So, while the Mexican government did banish Japanese citizens from Baja California in 1942, I don't want to give the impression that Mexico had a racially based internment policy analogous, or internment camps analogous to what was going on in the U.S. With a couple of exceptions, such as Cardenas's restrictions on U.S. military personnel, the United States was generally happy with Mexico's help during the first few months of 1942. Significantly, on March 27th, again before Mexico's declaration of war, the U.S. made Lend-Lease materials available to Mexico. American military hardware could start flowing to Mexico, up to $10 million worth, at a 52% discount. This was a pretty big investment. The U.S. government invited Mexican Foreign Minister Ezequiel Padilla to Washington, D.C. in March 1942. Padilla received an especially warm welcome and favorable consideration of a request he brought from his government for $20 million to rebuild Mexico's rail transportation network. The goodwill generated by Padilla's visit was enough to get him on the cover of Time magazine. Not bad, the previous week's cover had featured Douglas MacArthur. Given the fact that Mexico was not directly targeted by the Axis powers, it stands to reason that what eventually brought the country into the war formally was U-boat attacks. German submarines were operating all over the east coast of North America, targeting shipping in various lanes. In May 1942, the German submarine U-564, commanded by this man, Reinhard Suren, was prowling off the coast of Florida. In its scope's heat, the U-boat sighted an oil tanker about 6.5 miles south of Key Biscayne. It was within sight of this location, the Fowey Rocks Light, completed in 1878. The ship was called the SS Potrero del Llano, 4,000 tons, built originally in England in 1912. Ironically, Mexico got the ship from the Axis powers. It was under Italian registry when the Mexican government seized it in Tampico on June 10, 1940, the day Italy declared war on France. On this voyage, the Potrero del Llano was hauling oil toward New York City. Just before midnight, on May 13, 1942, a torpedo fired by the U-564 detonated near the bridge of the Puerto del Llano. The ship went down quickly, killing 13 people, including the captain. Another member of the crew died later in hospital. There were 21 survivors. The Mexican public was outraged. Nazi Germany had drawn blood against Mexico. Would it get the country officially into the war? The response in Mexico to the disaster was swift and pretty strongly against Germany. German businesses in Mexico City were stoned. An important newspaper, El Popular, the mouthpiece of the CTM Trade Union Federation, urged President Avila Camacho to declare war. On May 14th, through the Swedish legation, the Mexican government delivered an ultimatum to Nazi Germany, telling the mustache that he had 1 week until May 21st to apologize for the incident and pay reparations. And if he didn't, Mexico would take necessary measures. The Nazis ignored the ultimatum. Indeed, whether by deliberate design or just coincidence, Hitler doubled down and stuck an upraised middle finger right into Mexico's face. One day before the deadline expired, on May 20th, 1942, another ship, called the SS Faja de Oro, was sailing right about here, not far from the coast of Cuba, when she was spotted by another German U-boat, the U-106. Like Puerto del Llano, the Faja de Oro had also been originally built in England, and it was under the Italian flag when the ship was seized by Mexican authorities in Tampico the day after Pearl Harbor. The tanker, about 6,000 tons, was coming back to Tampico after delivering a load of oil in Pennsylvania. There was no oil aboard, she was just carrying ballast. The U-106 struck the Faja de Oro with 2 torpedoes at about 4:30 in the morning. She caught fire and went down, killing 10 people. This outrage simply could not be ignored, coming as it did seemingly in answer to the ultimatum from Mexico the previous week. In reality, I don't think it was. It's not like Hitler or Admiral Dönitz, the head of the Nazi Navy, saw the Mexican message and then shouted, "Screw these guys, go out and sink a Mexican ship right now." I don't think they gave a damn. Nazi Germany was already technically at war with 9 countries in Latin America, and with Mexico having little in the way of military assets that it could use against Germany or Japan, another declaration of war would be just a scrap of paper to them. That might seem like that's what it was, from the perspective of the Axis powers, but Mexico's formal entry into World War II was in fact a calculated political move, and its consequences within Mexican politics were pretty significant. That's the story we're going to get into in the next chapter. World War II for Mexico was not really about the Faja de Oro and the Potrero del Llano. It might be tempting to think so, again if you don't know much about Mexico, its history, or its political situation. The truth was, Manuel Avila Camacho and most of the Mexican government had already basically made their decision to get involved in World War II. Military and economic cooperation with the United States, committing to the idea of hemispheric defense, and breaking relations with the Axis powers makes that pretty clear. And that all happened in 1940 and 1941. I suspect that Avila Camacho knew Mexico would have to get into it formally, but it would take a precipitating incident, like the torpedoing of the tankers, to create the political circumstances for it to go through. However, it's not quite that simple. On May 22, 1942, President Avila Camacho convened a cabinet meeting. He decided, and most of the cabinet agreed, that they would ask the Mexican Congress for permission for the president to declare that a state of war existed with Germany and Japan, and grant him emergency powers to take the necessary measures. But even this was a little bit of a hedge. When his meeting with Congress was held, on May 28, 1942, Avila Camacho made a distinction between asking for a declaration that a state of war existed between Mexico and Germany and actually declaring war on Germany. Now that may seem like meaningless hair splitting, but it's not. He said, quote, "Now, if the state of war is war itself, the reason we have for proposing its declaration and not a declaration of war is based on very important arguments, which I feel obliged to clarify here. These arguments are of 2 kinds. On the one hand, the declaration of war presupposes in the person who decides it the spontaneous will to wage war, and Mexico would be inconsistent with its tradition as a pacifist country par excellence if it admitted, even in form, that it is entering into conflict of its own volition and not compelled by the rigor of the facts and the violence of the aggression." End quote. There was a major political reason why Avila Camacho insisted on this distinction. Polling as it exists in modern politics wasn't a thing in Mexico in 1942, and there was no way to really gauge the opinion of the Mexican public in the same way that modern pollsters using modern survey techniques would do. But two important Mexican news magazines did try to conduct a poll of 11,464 residents of Mexico City, just after the sinking of the Potrero del Llano, but before that of the Faja de Oro. Here were the results, again not scientific and only a small portion of Mexico City's residents. 59.3% of the total number of people polled did not want to enter the war at all. Among 2,144 respondents who self-identified as anti-fascists, communists, or oil and railway workers, 92.2% favored a full declaration of war. Of those who were not in those categories, 78.4% opposed entry into the war. Now, I know those numbers don't add up to 100%. Because we're talking about different sample groups here. But it should be clear, and it was clear to Avila Camacho, that a significant majority of the Mexican public did not want to enter World War II either at all or only on some limited basis. The biggest reason for this was undoubtedly distrust of the United States. One letter from a private citizen to the president, he received thousands of them, said, quote, "We Mexicans are not disposed to defend the gringos and cooperate with them in acts of war." End quote. There were conspiracy theories about what had happened, most of them suggesting that the United States engineered the sinkings and blamed Germany as a means to drag Mexico into the war. Indeed, even some officers of the Faja de Oro believed that the submarine that torpedoed them was American, not German. There is no actual evidence of that, and plenty of evidence to the contrary. German records seized after the war make clear that the Mexican ships were sunk by the U-564 and the U-106. The Mexican Congress, it has two houses, the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, each passed a resolution unanimously granting President Avila Camacho the power to declare a state of war. The declaration officially went into effect on June 1st, 1942. However ambivalently, whatever the reservations at home politically, Mexico was now officially a member of the Allies. As happened in almost all countries in World War II, propaganda posters began to appear in public places. Mexico's radio, newspapers, and cinemas didn't have nearly the reach that those institutions did in the US or other countries, so the propaganda poster was in many ways the main means of communication of pro-war messages to the ordinary Mexican people. Because they are so visible and interesting, propaganda posters are a major source for what historians have studied about Mexico in World War II. This one was particularly famous. It shows Avila Camacho, that's him at the lower right, as the latest in a line of Mexican national heroes, including Miguel Hidalgo, Benito Juarez, and Francisco Madero. In this kind of portrayal, the war is seen as the latest noble project to define Mexico's history and national identity. This is markedly different than British or American propaganda images of the war, which tended to stress national survival, personal sacrifice, or play up a desire to get revenge on the enemy. These themes aren't totally absent from Mexican war propaganda, but you tend to see them a lot less. One of the major tasks of the war, now that it was on, was to raise an army. You may wonder why the Mexican government wanted to do this, if it had no real intention of sending troops overseas to fight Nazis or Japanese. It was part of a project to modernize Mexico's military. Avila Camacho had already been pursuing this goal before war was declared. Remember, he got the tap of U.S. military supplies via Lend-Lease turned on in March 1942, 2 months before the sinkings and the declaration of war, however he defined it. In 1940, Mexico's army was about 50,000 strong, but about 20% of those were administrative personnel. Since the revolution had ended its violent phase in the 1920s, the main purpose of the Mexican army was internal security, putting down revolts and such. That's a very 19th century conception of a military. If Avila Camacho wanted to modernize, which he did, the army needed a new focus, an entirely new structure from the ground up. In August 1942, Mexico passed the Compulsory Military Service Law, a draft. It specified that all men from ages 18 to 45 had to serve 1 year of military training, and if necessary be deployed, though that wasn't really in the cards yet. For the first time, Mexico had a modern military reserve system. The program also developed military training in schools. Avila Camacho was not building an army for the purpose of storming Guadalcanal or Berlin, but to guarantee the military security of Mexico, basically forever. What's quite surprising, given the way Mexico guarded its sovereignty against the United States, was that the government raised no objection to the United States drafting Mexican citizens who were living in the United States. An agreement between Mexico and the U.S., signed on Christmas, December 25, 1942, expressly permitted this. Mexico did not gain the right to draft Americans living in Mexico into its own army. By some estimates, 250,000 Mexicans served in the American armed forces during World War II. Many served eagerly. A private in the U.S. Armed Forces made $37 a month, and for some Mexican men, this was a considerable wage that they couldn't earn in Mexico. Many also eagerly signed up for the Bracero program, which I'll talk about in the next chapter. Mexicans didn't fare too well in the U.S. Army, which was a highly racist institution. It was still segregated in the 1940s, and racist treatment of Mexicans and Latinos in general was rampant. American racism against Chicanos was the cause of the famous Zoot Suit riots, which occurred in Los Angeles in the summer of 1943. Men of Mexican descent wearing zoot suits were targeted for violence by U.S. servicemen, ostensibly because they wore flashy suits that used a lot of fabric, which was rationed. The suits were an excuse. It was just old-fashioned racism. This video is about Mexico in World War II, not what was happening inside the U.S. So aside from mentioning that the Zoot Suit riots occurred, I'm not going to get into any more detail on them. Speaking of riots, there were some within Mexico surrounding the issue of the draft. Riots and small rebellions broke out in Zacatecas, Guerrero, Puebla, and Morelos. In 1942 and 43, two brothers, the Jaramillos, led a series of draft riots in Morelos, probably the most serious disturbances related to military service. They were put down by the government. There was still a lot of anti-war sentiment out in Mexico's rural provinces. All this was going on, but Mexico's chief contribution to World War II was and was always intended to be a material one. Oil, wheat, corn, minerals, these were the things that really counted in the Second World War, and it's why the big flashy victories that we know about, like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, or D-Day, could occur at all. We have to devote some attention to subjects like grains and minerals and stuff like that. It's important to Mexico's story, and it's in the next chapter. If you take a battlefield-centric view of World War II, focusing on the Guadalcanals, Stalingrads, bombing raids, submarine actions in the Pacific, you know, the stuff they make movies about, it's hard to conceive of corn, rubber, and castor oil as being significant weapons in the Second World War. But they absolutely were. Food was a major driver of strategy during the war. Part of the whole reason the mustache invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 was to secure food supplies for Germany, which came largely from places like Ukraine. This is where Mexico truly earned its keep as a member of the Allies. And, as in the case of military and strategic cooperation, however rocky, Mexico often negotiated with the United States over these kinds of issues. Example, this is a lake called El Palmito in the state of Durango, in western Mexico. The whole reason this lake exists was because of the El Palmito Dam, which by the time of World War II was under construction. In 1943, the Mexican government agreed with the United States to increase the amount of land under cultivation by 3.3 million acres. This area around El Palmito was a major part of how the government intended to reach that number. Where would all these newly produced crops go? To the U.S., mostly. In fact, Mexico sent so much food to the United States that it started to develop a shortage at home. In 1943, rains were late, and then when they did come to Mexico, they were torrential and destructive. There were also cyclones, several droughts, early frosts, and even on the Yucatan Peninsula, a plague of locusts, shades of the Old Testament. These problems, combined with Mexico's high exports of foodstuffs to the U.S., made for a major corn shortage. 1943 was, in fact, the worst year of the 20th century for Mexican agriculture. The problem and its solutions were bound up with the war. The U.S. was suffering a shortage, if you can believe it, of edible oils. Vegetable, canola, flaxseed, rapeseed, that sort of thing. Some of the varieties of these oils hadn't traditionally been used in Mexico, and what ones were used were generally for domestic consumption. So, the crops that produced them weren't grown in the quantities you need for large-scale export. But some of these oils had military applications too, which is one reason why Americans wanted them. For example, castor seeds were used to make a type of oil that was used in brakes for jeeps and other machines. Rapeseed oil was used in airplane engines, and there was no synthetic substitute known at that time. Certain kinds of nuts could yield oils that were useful in making explosives. Bet you didn't know that. When we think of bombers coming off assembly lines in the US, you don't think that you need rapeseed oil to make them work, but you do. In February 1944, Mexico and the United States signed something called the Overall Agreement on Oil Seeds. Mexico agreed to increase its production of these kinds of seeds above what it needed for its own domestic needs. And in exchange, the U.S. would send over 1,000 tractors and other pieces of farm machinery to Mexico to help with planting corn acreage that could make up for the losses of the 1943 harvests. With the U.S.'s help, Mexico also became a producer of rubber. The Japanese had snatched most of the rubber-producing areas of Southeast Asia, so the Allies needed another supplier. In 1943, the U.S. and Mexican Secretaries of Agriculture, Claude Wickard and Marte Gomez, respectively, negotiated an agreement for a 1,500-hectare rubber plantation to be developed in Veracruz. This project even continued after World War II was over. Sugar was another needed commodity. It was in such short supply that it was rationed in the United States. Mexico agreed to supply 25,000 tons of sugar in 1942. The sugar shortage was so bad that the U.S. government blocked a deal between the Pepsi-Cola company and a Mexican company to develop syrups for Pepsi, because the sugar for the syrup was more acutely needed for the war effort. The food and crop shortage of 1943, which was extremely serious in Mexico, was caused not just by natural disasters and overproduction for the U.S. war effort. There was a labor shortage in Mexico too at that time, and that too was linked to the war through the Bratzel program. This is a major legacy of World War II in Mexico, and I first mentioned it in Chapter 1. In August 1942, shortly after Mexico declared war, or a state of war, or whatever it declared, the Avila Camacho administration negotiated an agreement with the U.S. State Department, enacted into law by Congress, whereby Mexican workers would be encouraged to come to the United States to work principally in agricultural operations and also railroads, in place of Americans who had been drafted or joined the armed forces. The Mexicans, at least the farm workers, would be guaranteed shelter, food, and 30 cents an hour wages, and they would be exempt from military service either in Mexico or the U.S. The first braceros arrived in Stockton, California in August. A bit more than 4,200 Mexicans came to the U.S. during 1942, but the number sharply increased in the later war years. As many as 62,000 in 1944. Sounds great, right? Americans got the workers they needed, Mexicans got paid, real cooperation for hemispheric defense. It didn't work out that way. As you might expect, Mexican bracero workers were treated with ferocious racism and institutional neglect as soon as they arrived. The quarters they were promised were rundown and dirty, medical care was substandard, food was terrible, and although wages were set by law, wage theft by the employers was rampant. Mexicans, as you recall, have labor protections built into Mexico's constitution. Those protections did not exist in the U.S. So, numerous strikes occurred among bracero workers who organized against unfair practices. There were strikes in Oregon and Washington state in 1943, many in Idaho in 1944, and large-scale labor unrest everywhere in 1945. In some cases, the trigger for strikes was that fruit growers were paying white workers a higher wage than they were to Mexicans. Again, despite the fact that the wages, which weren't that high anyway, were supposedly set by law. In short, the United States thoroughly and consistently abused the bracero program, which makes it a wonder that it continued even after the war, well into the 1960s. And it didn't have a good effect on agriculture back in Mexico. Between the harvest problems in 1943 and the lack of workers who had gone, perhaps foolishly, north of the border for work, by 1944, Mexico was facing a serious food shortage. Mexican authorities begged the United States to import food for them to offset this crisis. American officials, blinded by, you guessed it, racism, chalked it up to the incompetence of Mexicans to be able to feed themselves, despite the fact that Americans were siphoning off significant parts of Mexico's food crops. Even when Mexico tried to find solutions to this, Americans got in the way. For example, Mexico bought a bunch of grain from Canada, which was stored in warehouses in the Toronto area. But they couldn't get U.S. railroad companies to divert rail cars to carry it down to Mexico. Ultimately, it took a unified effort by allied governments, including Mexico, to buy grain in Adelaide, Australia, and ship it across the Pacific to the Mexican West Coast. The last-second infusion of Australian grain in 1944 may have averted a large-scale famine in Mexico, which could easily have been prevented if various planners, particularly in the United States, had been paying more attention to the situation. Historians and economists have crunched a lot of data to try to understand what was really happening in Mexico during the war years and shortly after them. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the numbers, but there's a compelling case that the standard of living of most Mexicans actually went down during World War II. Inflation ran high, wages were frozen, and production increased. People were working longer hours for smaller return. The governments and industries couldn't tolerate anything that would depress production for the war effort. Furthermore, recall that Mexico, largely rural and agrarian, was mostly a subsistence farming economy at the beginning of the 1940s. All of the sudden emphasis on producing surpluses for the war effort essentially squeezed the subsistence farmers in Mexico even more. Not only were they working harder for less money, but they had less to work with, less land, less labor, less capital. In real terms, the Mexican economy probably shrank during World War II, but the numbers that planners in the Mexican and U.S. governments paid attention to were growing. Indeed, some reports were prepared in 1946 for incoming Mexican President Miguel Alemán, which quantified the decline in Mexico's overall standard of living. Those reports were suppressed and not released to the public. Outwardly, Mexico supposedly came through the war stronger and richer, and in many ways it did. But that's an incomplete picture. As is inevitable in wartime, there were also fat cats and speculators who were getting rich on loopholes in wartime contracts, or the contracts themselves. This greedy behavior inevitably hurt the lower classes. In April 1943, an American diplomat, one William Ailshee, wrote to the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, that, quote, "The great masses of peasants and low-wage workers are finding it difficult to purchase the bare necessities of life, while Mexico is being flooded with Hollywood actors and actresses, high-pressure American salesmen and promoters, and international financiers," end quote. For as much as he positioned himself as the continuation of Mexico's grand national story, Avila Camacho was linked to corruption. That was mainly through his brother, Maximino Avila Camacho, who was a constant headache for the president. Maximino had risen through the army during the revolution, same as his younger brother, but he was more of the traditional Mexican strongman, part military commander, part crime boss, known by the somewhat untranslatable term of caudillo. He was arrogant, rude, flamboyant, and corrupt, often appearing in public in silk suits, and was well known for corruption. Despite the advice of many in his party, President Manuel Avila Camacho appointed Maximino to his cabinet. He was head of the Ministry of Transportation and Communications. This department was responsible for a lot of public works, road building, and that sort of thing. Maximino took a cut of various contracts he awarded so often that he earned a nickname, Mr. 15%. His loud and boorish public antics often embarrassed his brother, the president. But he was too loyal to him as family to dismiss him, despite the constant black eyes he caused in the press and public. Toward the end of the war, Maximino Avila Camacho looked forward to succeeding his brother as president in the elections of 1946. It would be a showdown within the PRM party between Maximino and Miguel Alemán Valdés, usually known as Miguel Alemán, who was then the Secretary of the Interior. Maximino hated Alemán so much that he claimed that if he became the nominee of the party, Maximino would kill him. Had Maximino been nominated, which, due to the lack of a viable opposition party in Mexico, was tantamount to election, it would have been the next phase of an Avila Camacho family dynasty. A lot of people were uneasy at that idea. Fortunately, it didn't come to that. On February 17, 1945, Maximino Avila Camacho, who was severely diabetic, died of a heart attack. The attack happened during a party at Maximino's estate to honor Fulgencio Batista, the American-backed dictator of Cuba, who years later would be overthrown by Fidel Castro. There were sketchy rumors that Maximino had been poisoned, but no evidence to support it. As we'll see, Alemán went on to be elected president in 1946. On April 20th, 1943, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt arrived in Monterrey, Mexico, for a brief visit, the first face-to-face meeting between FDR and Mexican President Manuel Avila Camacho. The visit was mostly ceremonial, without much political substance, but the two leaders seemed to get on well. They proceeded together to a U.S. Navy base at Corpus Christi, Texas, the Mexican president on U.S. soil, to return the courtesy of Roosevelt's visit. This move made the papers, but a much more consequential visit, which began 8 days later, generally got little coverage. A Mexican military delegation visited Washington, D.C., and then traveled on with U.S. military officials across the Atlantic to North Africa, where the Mexicans would observe American military operations. The officer representing the Mexican Air Force was Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Cárdenas Rodriguez, who appeared in our story in Chapter 1. Indeed, Rodriguez participated as an advisor in U.S. Army Air Force bombing missions over Sardinia and Sicily, which at that time was being softened up for a U.S. and British invasion that would get rolling in July. This visit came as there was increasing talk in Mexico that Mexican personnel should eventually participate in actual combat operations in the war. President Avila Camacho hadn't gone there yet, but it was in the wind. At first, both the Mexican and American governments were against the idea of Mexican forces going into battle. Cárdenas, the former president and now Secretary of National Defense, even mocked the idea. When a reporter from the New York Herald Tribune asked him if Mexicans would fight in the war, he said, "With arrows, with stones? Mexico lacks almost completely the equipment necessary for modern war." End quote. Although the idea of Americans training Mexican units and equipping them had been floated, the U.S. was already doing that with some select forces from Brazil, it wasn't thought of as a viable idea, probably because of, guess what, racism. Indeed, a June 1943 War Department memo stated that, quote, "The people of Mexico are psychologically unprepared for overseas service and will continue so until the war is brought home closer to them." End quote. Way to have faith in your allies, guys. Fortunately, not all American officials thought so. The new U.S. ambassador to Mexico was in favor of Mexican participation and suggested air forces would be a good place to start. And by this time, summer 1943, President Avila Camacho was beginning to come around to the idea. By 1943, after the turning points of Guadalcanal and Stalingrad, it was clear that the Allies were going to win the war, even if actually finishing it would take several more years. Allied leaders were already thinking of what the post-war world would look like. To his credit, Avila Camacho was also thinking about that, and he wanted to be sure Mexico would have a place in it. Whatever shape the peace negotiations might take, Avila Camacho figured that countries who had actually fought on the battlefields were likely to have more influence than those who sat on the sidelines. By November 1943, Avila Camacho was talking about this possibility amongst his advisors, and even Cardenas had come around to see his point of view. The president endorsed the view that the Mexican Air Force was the most viable option for sending Mexicans into battle. Throughout the beginning of 1944, back-channel negotiations between Mexico City and Washington eventually ripened into a formal offer by Mexico to contribute an air squadron. The details were still to be worked out. As this was in the pipeline, on April 10, 1944, President Manuel Avila Camacho walked across the courtyard of the National Palace toward his offices, when an army officer, Lieutenant Antonio de la Lama y Rojas, whom he knew, came up to him. De Lama pulled a .45 out of his coat and tried to pump a slug into him. The bullet went through Avila Camacho's coat and vest less than an inch from his body. He grabbed the assassin and pinned his arms until presidential guards ran up and subdued him. Incredibly, Avila Camacho asked them to bring De Lama to his office, where he questioned him. As the newspapers reported, this exchange occurred. Avila Camacho said, "Why did you fire at me?" The would-be assassin replied, "I have been trying for a long time to see you. There is no justice in Mexico." Avila Camacho asked why. De Lama replied, quote, "Because I am not permitted to go to church wearing my uniform," end quote. This was a reference to an order that Avila Camacho had signed in November 1943, which said that soldiers in uniform couldn't attend religious ceremonies because, quote, "the rites of religious creed do not conform with the dignity of the military uniform and insignia, nor with the martial personality of military men," end quote. I said in an earlier chapter that Manuel Avila Camacho usually gets credit for tamping down the conflict between the Catholic Church and the Mexican state post-revolution. However, the April 1944 assassination attempt shows that that conflict wasn't entirely over. Antonio de la Lama was identified as a pro-Catholic extremist and also a member of the Sinarquista, the pro-Nazi organization that had been a thorn in the side of the government for some time. There's no evidence that the attempt was sponsored or even known about by Germany, but it illustrates the currents that were still swirling around in Mexican political life during the war years. Incidentally, a few days later, Antonio de la Lama was shot while in police custody, possibly on the orders of Maximino Avila Camacho, the president's brother. In the summer of 1944, an American Army Air Force delegation visited Mexico to finalize the details and the financing of Mexico's contribution. It was decided that 42 officers and 249 enlisted men would be trained in the United States. Mexican officers would command the squadron, but it was attached to the 58th Fighter Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces. While selection and training went on in the summer, technically the unit still needed an official authorization from the Mexican Congress to operate outside the Western Hemisphere. This is Victoria Regional Airport in Victoria, Texas. It started its life as a U.S. Army Air Force training base even before the United States entered the war in late 1941. After arriving first at Laredo, Texas on July 24, 1944, the men of the 201st Fighter Squadron entered flight training here and at two other air bases, another in Texas and one in Idaho. After several months of training, the 201st Fighter Squadron reassembled in Texas and prepared for combat. President Avila Camacho had himself lobbied American officials to send the Mexican unit into action in the Philippines. By this time, General Douglas MacArthur, whom Avila Camacho personally admired, had fulfilled his famous promise, "I will return," and in October 1944, he did, at the head of a major American invasion of the Japanese-held Philippine Islands. In addition to Avila Camacho's admiration of MacArthur, politically he thought that Mexicans fighting overseas to liberate a Spanish Spanish-speaking people was more appropriate than sending them, for instance, to Germany. In late December 1944, Avila Camacho finally asked Congress for the authorization. It was granted on December 29, 1944, unanimously. It was still several months before the Aztec Eagles squadron actually took off in a combat zone and fired in anger at Japanese targets. That was in June 1945, and Germany had already surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The war was over in Europe. While the fighting in the Pacific was still ferocious, the ultimate outcome of the war wasn't in doubt. It was just a question of how long it would take. So, this is where we started. The 201st Fighter Squadron in action in the Philippines and the enthusiastic reaction of the Mexican public. President Avila Camacho's term was almost complete. He had taken Mexico through the war crisis and leveraged it to advance significantly his own, his party's, and Mexico's economic and political goals. And Mexicans themselves had finally gotten into the fight. Now they had to try to discern what the post-war environment would look like and where Mexico would be in it. That's the subject of the next chapter. In early 1945, three main candidates were positioning themselves to succeed Avila Camacho as president of Mexico in 1946. One of them was the president's brother, Maximino Avila Camacho, who, as I mentioned earlier, died suddenly in February 1945. Then there was Foreign Minister Ezequiel Padilla, who had been the official face of Mexico overseas and successfully negotiated with various allied governments. Indeed, the war was the whole reason why Padilla was a conceivable candidate. The foreign ministry was never traditionally a political springboard to higher office. Unfortunately for him, Padilla had a lot of political enemies who criticized him as a lackey of the United States. The war had gone well, but Mexican politicians could still pay a price for being tied too closely to the interests of the gringos. Padilla would run, but he faced an uphill battle to gain political traction. The other major candidate was the Interior Minister, Miguel Alemán Valdés. Given the fact that Mexico's major elections were all at least a little bit corrupt, Alemán was the practical frontrunner because his ministry controlled the election machinery in Mexico. As you recall, that had proven fortunate for Avila Camacho in 1940. The president was eager for his party and the major Mexican labor unions to unite behind a candidate fairly early and avoid exposing political rifts that the right, still in disarray, might unify to exploit. On June 4, 1945, indeed the very day that the Aztec Eagles squadron went into action in the Philippines, Miguel Alemán resigned from the cabinet and started his election campaign. He had the political blessing of Cárdenas, and within a few days that of the CTM, the powerful trade union federation. They endorsed Alemán as their candidate. The fact that the 201st Fighter Squadron was making headlines constantly in Mexican papers in this period only inured to Alemán's benefit. Avila Camacho certainly wasn't going to buck the CTM, so he told everyone he was pleased with their choice. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its intention to surrender unconditionally to the Allies. On September 1, 1945, one day before the official surrender was signed on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri, President Avila Camacho addressed the Mexican Congress. His words are very interesting, and I think they support the main thesis of this video. He was interested primarily in continuing and completing the major social projects of the Mexican Revolution, and he framed the war as part of that process. He said, quote, "To interrupt the program of the revolution would be not only to erase 35 years of our life and more than a century of our history, but also to lose the war that the democracies won, and to lose it in our country, to lose it ourselves." End quote. In November 1945, the men of the 201st Fighter Squadron returned to Mexico to a hero's welcome. Several, in fact. In order to hammer home the point about the war being the completion of the Mexican Revolution, President Avila Camacho milked the homecoming of the squadron for all it was worth politically. There were parades and celebrations in numerous cities, climaxing with a crowd of 20,000, including Avila Camacho himself, welcoming them in the Zocalo in central Mexico City. The president awarded them medals and accepted a ceremonial battle flag. This seems like it should be the end of the story, right? Well, it wasn't. There were still political challenges ahead for the president in his final months in office. A month or so after the 201st Squadron homecoming, there was a mayoral election in the city of León, in the state of Guanajuato. Remember the Sinarquistas, the pro-fascist right-wing group, one of whose members tried to assassinate Avila Camacho in 1944? Well, they supported a candidate for the mayor of León, Carlos Obregón, against the candidate of the ruling party, Ignacio Quiroz. When the votes were counted, Quiroz seemed to have won, but everybody knew the election was rigged, and an investigation confirmed it. Supporters of Obregón, mostly from the rural outlying areas, descended on León for the inauguration of Quiroz, the crooked candidate who was being sworn in. Several contentious demonstrations broke out. On January 2nd, 1946, troops opened fire on the crowd. The official death toll was 30, but the Red Cross said 74 had been killed and 200 wounded. The government contended that the Sinarquistas were trying to start a rebellion across Mexico, but there was no evidence of that. Ultimately, President Avila Camacho nullified the results of the crooked mayoral election. After an investigation, Obregón was ultimately installed as mayor, which is what the vote, if it had gone fairly, would have decided. The massacre in León was a serious blow to Avila Camacho's government, and a problem for Miguel Alemán, who was supposed to be nominated for president by the ruling party PRM in a couple of weeks. There was talk of postponing the convention, but it ultimately went ahead. Nevertheless, the party's leadership, eager to give the impression that it was cleaning house, changed the party's name to Partido Revolucionario Institucional, or PRI. Despite these difficulties, the right wing in Mexico was unable to capitalize on them. The war had decimated the conservative opposition to the ruling party, politically speaking. As the León massacre of January 1946 demonstrates, people on the right, such as the Sinarquistas, still existed in substantial numbers and influence, but they couldn't come together to make a difference at the polls, at least on a national level. Mexico's first election following the end of the war took place on July 7, 1946. Miguel Alemán Valdés was the overwhelming favorite, with Ezequiel Padilla running a close second. When the votes were counted, Alemán won more than 77% of the vote. There is convincing evidence of various voting irregularities in this election, but not nearly enough to affect the outcome. The election was probably dirty, like the 1940 election, but also like that one, it arrived at the same result that probably would have been achieved if the election was entirely clean. Now that doesn't make it right, but that is probably the fact. The election of Alemán was really the final act of World War II in Mexico. Though it sounds like an oxymoron, the title of one of the books I used to research this video is curiously accurate. The war has brought peace to Mexico. But it also came at a cost. Mexico's place in the world was markedly different than it had been before the war. Many in Mexico and around the world clearly saw that the post-war world was going to be binary. You were either in the orbit of the United States and the so-called free world, or you would be in the sphere of Soviet-style communism. This basic change in how the world worked was a major change in Mexico's place in it. Avila Camacho had leveraged the war crisis to gain concessions and advantages from Mexico's relationship with the United States, which previously was often acrimonious. Mexico would unfortunately lose that flexibility in the post-war environment. Everyone had to choose sides. There was no equivalent of the Marshall Plan for Latin America, but the United States did extend lots of foreign aid to Latin American countries who were, as they had been politically, roped into the economic, banking, and trade system generally developed by the United States as a counter to Soviet communism. Part of that economic system was the development of a common means of measuring the economic health and production of the country, the concept of GNP, or Gross National Product, which was widely adopted by many countries in the post-World War II era, including Mexico. Now, I know this sounds dull and not very consequential, but actually it is. Back in Chapter 2, when I was setting the scene for what Mexico was like at the beginning of the 1940s, I talked about how a great deal of Mexico's people were still rural, and much of the work they did, particularly by women, was of a simple subsistence nature. Small farming, artisanal crafts, hauling water from the well, tending livestock, making food for the family, that sort of thing. When Mexico became a modern economy wired into the system of U.S.-dominated banking and economics, which it did as a direct result of World War II, Mexico adopted the GNP or GDP concept for how to measure its economy. That was a prerequisite for doing business with and getting foreign aid from the United States in the Cold War era. But by adopting that concept of how to measure its economy, Mexico excluded all that work and all that economic activity that was being done by those poor rural people whose labor didn't register on the scale measured by GNP numbers. GNP and GDP measure economic transactions, money changing hands, goods sold, and wages paid. A woman in a small rural village who works for sunup to sundown gathering water, cooking food, taking care of the children, and keeping life going for that village never cashes a paycheck or sells the results of her labor on the open market. Therefore, she is invisible to Mexico's GNP. In fact, she and all the millions of Mexicans like her are instantly classified as poor, and Mexico as a quote-unquote poor country. Stephen Niblo, one of the historians whose work I consulted heavily while researching this video, put it this way. He said, quote, "The accumulators of Mexican statistics by 1947 estimated that of the 23 million Mexicans alive at that time, only 6,777,137 were economically active. Thus, more than 16 million people were excluded from consideration as being actively involved in the economic life of the country. Economic policies, government intervention, or even the great industrial push, therefore, would not include provisions for that majority, and their number went far beyond the aged and the very young." End quote. So, as much as Mexico achieved in World War II, this was also one of the legacies of the war. Mexico chose not to measure, and thus not to value, the labor of nearly 70% of its population. Here is what happened to some of the major players in our story in later years. Antonio Cardenas Rodriguez, the commander of the Aztec Eagles Squadron, won numerous awards and decorations as a result of his service. He was decorated by Douglas MacArthur, and in addition to Mexican decorations, he was given awards by the governments of Cuba, Nicaragua, Panama, Ecuador, Brazil, and the Philippines. He served for a few years after the war and ultimately retired from the Mexican Air Force. He died in 1969. The Bratzel program significantly outlasted the end of World War II, but its implementation was always rocky and inconsistent, and it was always a point of controversy between the United States and Mexico. American employers generally refused to grant to Mexican workers the labor protections they were guaranteed in the Mexican Constitution. And as the U.S. turned increasingly more hostile toward immigration from Mexico in the 1960s, the program grew ever more controversial in Congress. The program was terminated by the U.S. Congress in 1964, just before a new immigration regime was enacted into law, one that remains hotly controversial, especially in U.S. politics, down to the present day. For Mexicans, the end of the program jump-started efforts to unionize Mexican labor in the United States, especially in the agricultural sector. That led to the historic activism of Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and the United Farm Workers. The PRM party, which changed its name to PRI in 1946 after the León massacre, continued in power for many decades after the World War II era. It was not always the left or socialist-leaning party of Cardenas, seeking to institutionalize the social gains of the revolution. The PRI party presided over what came to be known as the Mexican Miracle, which was essentially the long-term growth of the economy in GNP-GDP terms along the lines that had been set down during World War II. But the party became increasingly conservative, and some say lazy, as it was entrenched in power with no real opposition. Its corruption grew. A sea change occurred in Mexican politics in the year 2000,
when the PRI candidate, Francisco Labastida,
was defeated by Vicente Fox, the first electoral defeat PRI had ever suffered on the national level. Mexican politics has been consistently chaotic since that time. The World War II era was the beginning of the decline for artist Frida Kahlo. She was briefly suspected of complicity in the murder of her lover, Leon Trotsky, in 1940, but it soon became clear that she hadn't been. She had terrible health problems, for which she was treated with repeated painful surgeries in Mexico and the U.S. She joined the Mexican Communist Party in 1948. Frida Kahlo died on July 12, 1954, supposedly of a pulmonary embolism, though some close to her suspected she took her own life with painkillers. She remains a national symbol of Mexico and its cultural heritage today. Cantinflas, also known as Mario Moreno, rode the wave of the golden era of Mexican cinema that had begun in the early 1940s and continued after World War II. On film, he played bullfighters, police officers, and numerous comedic leading men. He broke into Hollywood briefly as the character of Passepartout in the 1956 film Around the World in 80 Days, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture that year. He continued to work into the 1980s. Cantinflas died of lung cancer in Mexico City in 1993. Juan Andreu Almazan, the right-wing candidate who opposed Avila Camacho in the 1940 election and briefly tried to raise a revolt against him, calmed down and behaved himself after it became clear that his bid for power had failed. He attended Avila Camacho's inauguration. Almazan remained a wealthy property owner and railroad magnate, and for years owned the El Papagayo Hotel in Acapulco, a place that began to see a lot of tourism, particularly from Americans, during World War II. Feeling he was politically misunderstood, Almazan wrote several memoirs in his later years attempting to explain himself and how his political philosophy really was consistent with the revolution, regardless of however Avila Camacho tried to spin history. He traveled extensively in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the U.S. He died in 1965 in Mexico City. Lázaro Cárdenas, the fiery president of Mexico between 1934 and 1940, resigned as defense secretary in 1945, as it was clear that the war was basically won. He wielded some limited political power behind the scenes, opposing the rightward drift of the PRI party. Cárdenas was horrified at the massacre in Mexico City in 1968, which exposed how rigid and authoritarian the party had become. He died not long after, in 1970. Alemán, Avila Camacho's successor, was toying with the idea of having the Mexican Constitution amended so he could be re-elected in 1952. Cárdenas and Avila Camacho joined together to squelch that idea, making a public statement that allowing re-election would not be, quote, convenient for the country. The tumultuous 1952 election saw Alemán succeeded by Adolfo Ruiz Cortines.
After the presidency, Alemán headed up Mexico's tourism agency and helped bring the 1968 Olympics to Mexico. He died in Mexico City in 1983.
Manuel Avila Camacho, having brought Mexico through World War II and used it successfully to complete the revolution, at least as he saw it, had a calm and uneventful post-presidency. He went back to his farm after leaving office and lived a quiet life. He died in 1958, as quiet and generally unpretentious in his final years as he had been during his life. The story of Mexico in the Second World War is truly a sleeper of a subject in history. From a casual glance at Google or Wikipedia, or if, God forbid, you do the wrong thing and rely on some AI chatbot to summarize history for you, you'll come away with the erroneous impression that the 201st Fighter Squadron, the Aztec Eagles, was pretty much the main show. Occasionally, you might hear about the ships, the Faja de Oro and the Potrero del Llano, or the Bratzel program, but that's about it. I'm a PhD historian, and I didn't know the name of Mexico's president during World War II until I started the research for this project. Now, having been through this story, you might be amazed at how little of it really has to do with the top punchline items, the Aztec Eagles, or the ships, or the Bratzel program. Like an iceberg, 90% of the story of Mexico in World War II is below the waterline. I'm going to restate my thesis that I started with in this video. Between 1939 and 1945, Mexican political leaders, particularly Lázaro Cárdenas and Manuel Ávila Camacho, leveraged the crisis of the war, both to achieve their objectives within Mexico's domestic political arena, and also to jumpstart the process of modernization and industrialization of the country. Mexico's participation in World War II was a political move made not to project Mexican power overseas, but to accomplish political and economic goals within Mexico, which represented, to Cárdenas and Ávila Camacho, nothing less than the successful completion of the Mexican Revolution. You have to have some sense of the breadth of 20th century Mexican history to understand how the war fits into it, and how, in a very real sense, it defined it. You now know that story. If you like this video, please hit the like button, share it, thumbs up, do all the stuff that you normally do for a video you like. Consider joining the members section on my YouTube channel. You'll find there an ad-free version of this video with significant additional material, as well as some stuff that didn't fit into this one as a result of ad-friendly guidelines. The sources I used to make this video are listed in credits at the end and also down below in the description. As usual, I want to say that no part of this video, including the research or writing of the script, was done with AI. My novel that came out in December 2024, The Gangster Crown, is available on Amazon Kindle and in paperback. The link to that is in the description. I also teach history classes online at my website, seanmunger.com. And you can sign up for my blog at gardenofmemory.net and get the columns delivered directly to your email. Thank you to all my fans and supporters. And thank you once again for joining me on another journey into the past.
Es la mujer mexicana la que tiene.
Para cantar la bamba se necesita una
Como dos azucenas